All right. So we're going to start our webinar on drawing on assets to inform teaching and learning. So I'm your facilitator, Dr. LaTanya Gaines Montgomery, and here's my email if you have any questions. The outcomes for this session are to identify ways to leverage assets of clinical educators and student teachers in the classroom. And clinical educators will also support student teachers with this process in leveraging student assets in the classroom. So this connects to the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards, and here are the standards that it connects to. So as we go through, you may want to think about your own classroom prior to your student teacher coming in as a guest educator and how their impact in your classroom as well as your impact can affect your growth plan and your own evaluation this year. So we're going to get started with the asset-based instruction and the STAR. So with the STAR rubric, there are 10 elements, and within these elements, the first 8 elements are all aligned to asset-based instruction. So if your student teachers have the asset-based lens with their instruction for planning, instruction, and assessment, then they will have high rankings on learning environment because they will use what they know about students to maintain a positive and nurturing classroom. They will use those assets to address differences and be inclusive of those cultures in their community, in the classroom community. They'll be able to plan for instruction that meets student needs as well as student abilities. They will be able to use a variety of instructional strategies based on their student assets. They will be able to apply the content knowledge and do creative thinking processes within their learning plans for students based on their assets in the classroom. Again, their assessments can be multifaceted. So based on what they know about the assets the students are bringing in the classroom, they may create project-based learning, do some informal assessments to align their assessments in the classroom with the assets of students. And then, of course, digital learning and collaboration are also a part of the assets, knowing your students' assets and using those within planning with digital learning tools and collaborating in activities. So defining assets. Assets are a useful or valuable thing, a person, or a quality. So an example would be quick thinking is his chief asset. So as we go through this PowerPoint, I want you to think about your student teacher as well as your students and the assets they bring into your classroom. What is asset-based teaching? Oh, this is a fairly new phenomenon, but it's when a teacher seeks to unlock students' potential by focusing on their talents. So it's also known as strength-based teaching, and it's in contrast with the more deficit-based style of teaching, which highlights students' inadequacies. So usually when we're thinking about differentiation, we're thinking about what a student cannot do. With asset-based teaching, you are thinking about what a student can do, what a student brings to the table, and using that to catapult your teaching, planning, instruction, and assessment. There is, we talked about growth mindset earlier in our trainings this year. So having a growth mindset is the first step to understanding the value of challenges and the opportunities for growth. Asset-based instruction is a step further than that in taking what you know about a person, which could be your student teacher or your student, and using that to leverage their learning and growth. So helping them to make connections based on the assets that they bring in. So building from their strengths versus building on their weaknesses. In SCPA, student teachers are asked about the assets of their students, personal, cultural, and academic. I want you to take a look at this screen, and then we're going to look at the 2 examples listed and discuss what assets student teachers bring with them to your classroom. In these two examples, the first one was a student teacher who has worked in their church youth group and knows about some of the apps that students that they will be working with within this age group might like, and can help to co-plan an activity with you to draw in those interests in the classroom. Another example is you. You might be a huge fan of music and play a guitar, and you bring that guitar and write a sonnet and share it with the students to model what they will have to do in class. These are assets that students can draw on based on interest, but also will connect with them for academic learning purposes as well. And so what we want to do is moving forward is ensure that as a clinical educator, you are understanding and processing through your relationship building with your student teacher what their assets are, and building on those to help them plan, to help them prepare, to help them instructionally, and to help them assess the student progress. So now here's your time to think. Think of a personal, cultural, or knowledge asset that you have that your fellow teachers may not know about. And then I want you to think about it and briefly describe what the asset is. How is it an asset? How might it be useful? And if your fellow teachers or PLC members knew about that asset, how might it contribute to their understanding of who you are and the work that you do with them? I'm going to give you a few minutes to process that. Connect. Okay, so that was just a little reflection time for yourself. Now I want you to think about your student teacher that's in your classroom. Think of a personal, cultural, or knowledge asset that your student teacher has based on what you know about them to this point in the experience. I want you to think about and briefly describe the asset on a separate sheet of paper. Think about in what ways that asset might be useful in student teaching for that particular student's experience. How can you encourage those assets in the teaching and learning cycle? And how can you help your student teachers use those asset-based teaching and learning that they have with their students? So in your section, if you would enter, you don't have to put your student teacher's name, but just their personal, cultural, or knowledge asset that your student has. Type that into the question and answer section. and how you would encourage those assets in the teaching and learning cycle for your student teacher based on your experience so far.
I'm gonna say something.
Joyce put a question mark. If I unmute her, can I ask her? Can she talk? No.
They're all muted upon entry.
Gotcha. Oh, somebody just popped up a question over here on this side of the screen. I just don't know how to get to it. Carrie said something. I can't, she typed in something, but the message is popping up over here. This is weird. Oh, goodness. Okay. Oh, here we go. She put it under chat. That's So we've got a response where a CE has shared that a student teacher has a child that's near the age of the student that they're teaching, so she's able to relate fairly well where they are developmentally. And that's a great point about having, that's an asset, that she personally has a child that's that age. And so because she knows where they are developmentally and has interactions with students of that age, it makes her more confident in dealing with students of that age and can use what she knows from her child's experiences that she has with her, the experiences she has with her child, to help promote some of the connections in the classroom. So that is absolutely an asset. Okay, so here are some suggestions for supporting teachers with asset-based teaching and learning. The first is to have them ask other educators who come from the same background, and this is what the research says, who have the same cultural background. So if I have L students and there's an ESL teacher who's at the school, I may ask for some strategies from that particular teacher because of their background and skill base. I may also ask a teacher who may have worked with them previously, who knows the student's background, their culture, for ideas and effective ways to teach those particular students. So encouraging your student teachers to kind of research the background as you would at the beginning when you're learning those students and their positive previous experiences. Visiting the community, having the students to interact with the students at basketball games or at breakfast duty or bus duty to kind of get to know the students and interact with them more outside of the classroom so that they can have a gauge of what those assets are for students. Have the student teachers ask students about their learning style preference, whether that might be a bell ringer or do now for the beginning of class one day, a learning style inventory with maybe 2 or 3 questions that ask students their interests or giving them an interest inventory, and there are several of those. If they Google interest inventories or learning style inventories, there are several of those that are online that they may consider using to collect information about the assets of their students. Interview or survey parents about how students learn best. One of the great opportunities for that would be open house. And even though open house is already passed, some schools have open classroom night or curriculum nights that are coming up that student teachers will be able to interact with students and parents and get information about how their students learn best. Also, having parents who are having phone calls from you, sitting in on those phone calls and gathering information about what the parent sees as a great way to keep their student connected in the classroom could also be a support. So if you're making parent phone calls, allowing your student teacher to sit in on that phone call and be able to gather some information that way. So basically using all of that information to design their classroom activities, projects, assessments, reading, and using all of those assets to create plans, give instruction, and give assessment. The different ways for them to be successful are setting goals with this. So if they have not looked at their own personal assets, having them to focus on a growth goal for themselves, understanding who they are, what they like, and how they can connect who they are and what they like to the classroom and instruction. This will help to drive their passion for teaching. And this will also give them realistic goals to set, because once they realize and identify their own professional growth, then they can then begin to move into doing so for their students as well. So having their students set SMART goals in the classroom based on their assets and their goals as well. This is also a good opportunity for them to activate prior knowledge. So for the portion of your lesson where they are activating background knowledge or a do now or a bell ringer, using those assets to pull in videos, to pull in activities, to pull in reading that will help make connections outside of the school for the students as you get ready to go into instructional learning material. And lastly, leveraging prior knowledge and having students give feedback about where they are with their goals, and the student teacher give feedback to the students based on what they've seen as far as where they are with their goals. So personal assets, cultural assets, academic assets are all important, especially in helping student teachers to understand the teaching and learning cycle of planning, instruction, and assessment. And for those of you who are lead CEs, and if you are lead CE, you know what I'm talking about, this is also important in leveraging your clinical educators in your building to support the overall student teachers in the building. So if you've got a clinical educator that is strong in one particular area, having them to do a mini PD for the student teachers and their clinical educators may be an option based on your assessment of their academic, personal, or cultural assets. So this is another way that you can use these assets within the school to help support student teachers, not just one individual in your classroom, but holistically within your building. I wanted to make sure that there was a clear line between differentiation. I kind of touched on this earlier. Differentiation is when a teacher attempts to respond to the variance of needs based on data of the learners in the classroom, but that lens is usually what a student can't do or what they need help with. With asset-based teaching, it focuses on strengths. So this student does struggle with this particular skill, but does this and this very well. So how can I make a connection between the two things that they do very well and then tie that to what they need? So it basically requires you to use both assets and weaknesses to determine the activities, the lessons and discussions that you will plan for the students. So, an example of students in the classroom who are using their assets that you can support your student teachers with doing in the classroom would be students who serve as language brokers. So children of immigrant families who translate and interpret for their parents and other individuals, which could be students in the classroom, might be a way to use assets in the classroom. This is something that you want to help students to think about, and it's a very basic example, but this is something you can help student teachers to think about as they plan. How might you integrate support of students to help other students in the classroom? And here are some leveraging learning and teaching links. There are some great videos. The second video link that you have here, and this will be shared with you, is a video of a teacher actually using academic and cultural language brokers in the classroom for digital citizenship. And so she's using the computers, the language of the students to get across a writing task that she has students doing. And so this video would be a great video for you to watch with your student teacher, or for you both to watch, and then to come together to reflect and talk about how the teacher uses assets within that lesson to drive student growth goals. And she will talk to you about that at the end of the video, about how students grew from the beginning to end of that project. The last thing that I want you all to do is to think about how you will help your student teachers use their assets to develop their teaching style. So you've had a student teacher in your classroom for a few weeks. Again, many of them don't have their professional identity yet. They don't realize how their interest and how the things that they like will connect to them teaching and help them to develop the style that they will use professionally in the classroom. How will you help them to gradually move from using their assets for teaching and learning to also doing that for students as well? So I want you to take a few minutes and then plan how you might do this. So this might start with you listing all the things that you know about your student teacher. And then how might you use those things to help them to gradually move to using those things to impact the teaching and learning cycle, which would be planning, instruction, and assessment. And then once you have a plan for that, think about how then do you move them from doing that for themselves to doing that for students in the classroom. So I'll give you a few moments to make a plan, and then you can share using your chat button on your screen. So I've received some responses, and thank you all for sharing. I see where someone said encourage them to utilize what they know to ask higher order questions, so that's an academic asset. There's a student who is a football player and has some male students that have similar interests, and they can bring those ideas to solving problems, which would be great. That's a great task, so when you're sitting with a student teacher and talking about planning, if they've just got a bunch of questions where students are having to solve problems, then you can ask them, how could we tie this into the questions, into things that students would be interested in, such as football? Because they may not even think about that. They're just thinking, I need to teach the students how to solve those problems. I also have one says that this one student teacher has a child with disability, so he can apply strategies he's learned for working with his child. So that would be a great way for a student teacher to come up with and think about differentiation strategies for students in the classroom, especially those who may have IEPs. I also have a response here that says student learning style inventories can be completed. So that's how she would help to support her student teacher with beginning to incorporate those various activities into her plans, because she's now starting to take over blocks of instruction. So absolutely, that is a great starting plan to think about how to support her or him with developing their own um, teaching identity and activities that students will connect to based on what they know about their own students. Also, exactly. There's another response saying helping the student teacher to think through the student responses prior to the lesson so they can feel more prepared. So, absolutely, understanding student assets also allows with anticipatory planning, and so allowing or helping the student to think through what do you already know about the students in this class. So, as you're planning the lesson, what questions might they ask you? What responses might they give you? And so because you already know them and can kind of anticipate what they may ask or what they may say in a response, you can have a response for those questions, or you can have a tailored response for the responses you might get back to help make sure that your lesson stays on track. Absolutely. So moving forward, we just ask that you would think about these assets. And as you're completing your OSF form, as you're preparing in the second assessment period to complete your STAR reflection, that you think about the assets that your student teacher brings to the classroom. And even in your feedback to them and your reflective feedback to them as they are starting to pick up blocks within the coursework, that you would have them to reflect on the things that they do well and the things that they don't do well. Try to make connections to the things that they do well so that they can build from their strengths and not feel so defeated. Asset-based instruction is a very powerful tool for students, but it is also very powerful for adults because we are able to build on things that we know we do well and kind of increase those things that were weaknesses and strengthen those things so that we it may not eradicate that weakness altogether, but it may strengthen that particular area so it's not so much of a weakness in the classroom. Are there any questions for me? If you have a question, you can submit it in the Q&A or in the chat. I'm seeing that some people are still even planning. I see where a clinical educator is saying about their student teacher has a dog, and several of the students have talked about their animals in the classroom. Also, a very great way to connect to students. And they can use that in planning, instruction, and assessment to help students to make connections and feel more a part of the instructional process than just being fed some facts and statistics. So absolutely. Well, if there aren't any more questions, we want to thank you for attending this webinar. We know you all have been teaching your hearts out all day long, so we didn't want to hold you for very long, but wanted to give you just a little nugget to take with you as you continue to influence our student teachers in a positive way to help them to be stronger in their practice in the classroom. And so we thank you for your participation this evening, and if you don't have any questions, we thank you for coming on this afternoon. Have a great evening.